So hi everyone, I'm Emily, one of the founders of Untangle, and at Untangle we help people through challenging life events like bereavements. We hold your hand through all the steps and provide a supportive community and match you to expert partners like therapists, solicitors, funeral directors. And I'm really delighted to have Cathy Hayward here today. And Cathy's worked as a journalist and editor before setting up her own successful PR company. And so after losing her parents in quick succession, she completed a creative writing program, and this emerged her debut novel, The Girl in the Maze. The story follows a woman who's just lost her mother and explores the complex relationship and challenges involved in both mothering and being mothered, which is a really interesting dynamic, particularly around grief. It won the Angora Books Lost the Plot Work in Progress Prize in 2020, which is amazing for a debut novel, and was longlisted for the Grindstone Literary Prize in 2020 as well. And I know you've been working on a book last year too. And at this event, Cathy's going to share her experience of losing her mother and how that, the grieving an absent relationship and also those feelings around that complexity as well. So really looking forward to Cathy sharing that. It's a really interesting topic, and thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Cathy. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask them throughout. Is the sound working okay for everyone else?
Yeah, okay. I can hear you okay.
All right, Heidi, I'll message you and we can work something out with that. But yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. If you don't want to ask them out loud, you can message me in the chat, and I can ask them as well. So whatever feels more comfortable. But I'm really delighted to welcome Cathy, and over to you, Cathy.
Well, thanks so much, Emily, and hi everyone. This is the first time I've kind of talked in quite so much detail about losing my mum and my dad. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But it's nice to be amongst people who are also going through similar kind of feelings of grief. So I'm 46. I'm a mum of 3 kids, aged 12, 14 and 19. And I live in Brighton on the south coast. As Emily said, I trained as a journalist and then went on to set up a PR company. And in August 2015, so 6 years ago, my father Bernard died, followed 7 months later by my mum Hilda. And I'd had a really different relationships with both of them. I was really close to my dad, whereas I hadn't seen my mum for 4 years, except for a short strained meeting just before she died. So I'm going to talk through how I experienced their losses really quite differently, and also coping with their deaths in kind of quick succession, because I was still grieving for my dad, obviously, when my mum died. As Emily said, I'm really happy to answer any questions as you go along, because I know it's kind of weird if you've got a question right at the beginning to wait to the end. I always forget what the question was, if that's me, or if you want to wait to the end, that's fine. I've also dug out a few family photos just to kind of illustrate the people that I'm talking about, and because as part of the research for the book I ended up writing, I did have to dig out some photos, and actually seeing them was really quite a moving experience. So I'm an only child, and I always felt much closer to my dad Bernard than to my mum, who seemed a pretty cross lady and pretty dissatisfied most of the time. They'd met on an opera tour in Germany in the 1970s, but had very, very little in common. So by the time I was 6, I think the marriage was pretty much over. My dad was a city banker, so he wore his sort of smart suits and shiny black shoes and commuted to the city every day. And my mum was very much a sort of bohemian artist figure. So quite how they decided they were going to get married and they were going to get on, I don't know, but they certainly didn't. And when I was about 13, they sat me down to say that they were buying a house in France and my mum was going to live there, in that sort of classic English understatement. They never talked about divorce or separation. They were just going to commute between different houses. And of course, the reality was that they did separate at that point. I went to a boarding school in the UK and really only saw my mum occasionally in the holidays. And as I grew older and kind of had a life in the UK, obviously I stayed much more in the UK and therefore with my dad. And between the ages of about 17, 18 and 2021, I didn't really see my mum at all. And then she moved back to the UK when I was 23, because by then she'd become quite ill with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of cancer. And she remained ill actually for the last 20 years of her life. It became terminal quite quickly. And for a couple of times in my 20s, we thought she was very close to the end, and said our goodbyes a number of times. On a slightly amusing side note, and I think although grief is a very difficult thing, if you can't laugh at some of the really awful things that happen, then it's a kind of a sad, even sadder time. So looking back at it, she'd been given a month to live, and her flat lease was up. And so we spoke to the landlord, gave up the flat that she was living in, but we didn't know what to do with her furniture and possessions. So we took some really personal items because she was in a hospice, and we put them in the room with her, and everything else we donated to the hospice. And all the furniture, she had some really lovely antique furniture, because the hospice had been so amazing. We thought, right, they can sell this and make money for themselves. So imagine, well, obviously delight when she didn't die, and then imagine I was given the job of explaining to her that she had no possessions beyond what was in the room, because we'd gone and sold everything. And she was pretty cross about that. And she referenced it at least, once a month after that. But fast forward 20 years, my parents were both in their late 70s. I was a mum of 3 by then, and my mother and me hadn't spoken for several years. It had been a kind of a gradual failing of the relationship, really, from the time that I was a teenager, and particularly after I had my second child in my early 30s, and she really took against that child, and I kind of decided enough was enough, and I went no contact. And I talked to my husband about it at the time, and he said that so long as I felt I wouldn't regret it if she died, then it was the right thing to do. She'd always been really difficult, and I have to say I felt quite relieved not to be in contact with her. So we celebrated my dad's 80th birthday in January 2015, and he was on pretty fine form. Then by April, he was complaining of what he called back-end trouble. And then within a few weeks, he kind of just disappeared. He was very difficult to get hold of. And we eventually tracked him down, and he admitted he was having a few tests. I offered to drive him to a specialist doctor. I think that was about June time. And then we heard together that he had cancer. It was a really remarkably upbeat meeting. We talked about the treatment, and we planned that I would stay with him in his flat for the weeks he had chemo, so I could support him. But they then said he needed his further tests to assess what chemo he would need and all that kind of stuff. And he had a colonoscopy and all that kind of stuff. The doctor ended up calling me, and then again, a slightly kind of bittersweet moment. I was actually with a client at a Neil Diamond concert at the O2, and I got a call from the doctor, went outside, took the call, and he then said, your father's cancer is terminal now, and we're not going to be able to treat him. I had to go back in and spend the rest of the evening with the client. Or I felt I should. Looking back at it, of course, I should have just left straight away. But I went back in and sat through and danced through the rest of this Neil Diamond concert. Anyway, we went for a meeting with the doctor to talk about what the next few months and possibly years, we didn't know, would look like. And you know that things are bad when the cancer care nurse comes to sit with you when you hear news. And we were told at that meeting that he had a month to live. There was to be no chemo, just palliative care. And so my reaction was to kind of leap into action, start arranging things, hospices, all that kind of stuff. And I wish now I'd probably taken time just to sit with him and hold his hand. He sat alone in that room digesting that news. But I think it was my way of coping what was obviously the start of grief. I'm a kind of doer, and I cope by doing things. So he moved into a nursing home, and gradually over the next kind of couple of weeks, he started to fade. He wrote his final letters or dictated them to me, and he called up my mum, who hadn't then spoken to for maybe 20, 25 years, and told her that he was dying. In retrospect, I think she was probably quite shocked, but I didn't appreciate that at the time, because again, I was going through my own kind of shock and grief. Overall, I found during that period, and I hadn't experienced much grief before then, just a grandparent dying when I was much younger, people are really reluctant to talk about death, and they're usually strange language to talk about it. So they were always urging him to eat more, to build himself up. We're like, he's dying. And as we got closer to this kind of month end, because he was given on the 22nd of July, he was told he had a month to live. So that was always on our kind of, how long would he last? I was always kind of fobbed off when I kept asking those questions. Then one day the nursing home staff asked if I could go to the chemist to get the end of life drugs, because they were ready. And I knew then obviously it couldn't be long. And the next day they gave me a leaflet about what to expect at the end, which was really useful, but still shrouded in really strange language. And my father had talked really honestly about death, and I felt that people around us really didn't, which I don't think probably helps the grieving process. A hospice nurse friend of mine said at the time that if people are getting worse year by year, they have years left, month by month, they have months left, weeks by weeks, etc., etc. And I thought that was really handy and honest piece of advice that perhaps people should talk about more. So having sat at my father's bedside for 6 weeks, it was a sunny day in late August 2015, and my kids were pestering me to take them out. They were young then, and of course it was the world's worst summer because they had spent their entire summer holiday sitting in a hospice doing jigsaw puzzles on the floor, watching their then granddad die. So after spending the morning there, I asked the nursing home staff, and they said they felt he wasn't close to death. And I asked a friend of his to sit with him for the afternoon. And I took my kids to the beach. And when we got back home, I called the nursing home, asked after him. They said he was fine. So I said to pass on my love, and I poured myself a large G&T. And then, of course, the inevitable happened. 30 minutes later, they call and they say that they think he's taking his last breaths. So I jump in the car, race up there. And I think I missed his actual death by a few seconds. But apparently, often people do want to die alone or without their relatives there. It took me probably a couple of years to really accept that. And I blamed myself for quite a long time for taking the afternoon off. But I sat with him for several minutes. But quickly realised I was just really sitting with the body, not in a weird way, but it just wasn't my dad anymore. So I went out into the garden and sat quietly there in the dark. And when I came the next day to clear his room, they'd moved the body, and I was really glad because it wasn't really him. So although I hadn't said everything I wanted to say to my dad, I felt really at peace with our relationship. There was nothing difficult between us. He'd loved me and I'd loved him. I wish I'd been a better daughter at times, particularly as a teenager when I was pretty dreadful, but it was a really good death, peaceful, quick, but not too quick. And so the grieving, I guess, which had started when I'd been told his cancer was terminal, really began in earnest in August. And there's so much admin around death, isn't there? There was so much stuff to do. And on a side note, actually, while my father was dying, our hamster was also on its last legs, and it had huge tumours on its body, and we had to adapt its cage. And when I was sitting with my dad, I used to drive home and wonder if the poor little hamster had died that day. And with gallows humour, I think I wondered who would die first. And usually I would have been like right on top of it and taking the hamster to the vet, but all my emotional energy was obviously focused on my dad at the time. A few days after my dad's death, I went to register his death at the town hall and decided I had to do something about the hamster. So I took it with me in its cage to the vet to be put down at last, and we received the ashes back shortly before my father's funeral. I just put them in a drawer at home and forgot about them. And my father had designed his funeral down to the nth degree, and it was a wonderful Catholic memoriam mass, followed down by a procession down the hill to the cemetery. And I managed to keep it together enough to read the eulogy, and the church was packed, and it was a really good funeral. After a few drinks in the wake, I decided to go back to the graveside alone. And there I discovered that someone had placed all the flowers that had been given on it. I hadn't really seen them before. So I read through them, and there was one from my mother, and it made me inexplicably angry. I remember just throwing it across the graveyard. I'm not really sure why. I perhaps felt that she was encroaching on my grief and she had no right to, but of course she did. They were actually still married. They'd never divorced. So for the next few weeks, I started to clear out my father's flat, which was heartbreaking and something I found really difficult at the time. I just didn't want to throw anything away that he touched. It took my ex-husband actually to start just throwing some obvious junk in a bin bag to help me kind of start the process. And at the same time, my mother began to contest his will, which I found really upsetting and spiteful, really. And I later found evidence that she knew she wasn't entitled to half of his flat, but she went for it anyway. So just before my father had died, I'd turned 40, and I'd always had a dream to write a book. And I had that kind of feeling that you do when you have a significant birthday, that if I didn't do it now, I might never do it. So just before he was given his terminal diagnosis, I signed up, as Emily said at the beginning, for a 2-year part-time creative writing course. I thought I could do some of the studying when I accompanied him on his chemo appointments. But of course, the course started 6 weeks after his death. But writing has always been a real source of joy to me. As I said earlier, I trained as a journalist and worked for years as a reporter and editor before going into PR. I read back through some of the material actually while I was thinking about this talk today. I looked back through some of the material I wrote in that first term, and you can really clearly see that I'm processing my father's death. So we had to do a senses exercise where we describe something using a sense other than sight. And I wrote about, and this is really grim, so I do apologise, but I wrote about helping my father to wee into a jug in the nursing home, and when he had his last uncontrollable bowel movement. I thought the rest of the class must have wondered what on earth was wrong with me. But just writing about some of the horror that we'd been through together in the nursing home in those last few weeks of his life really kind of helped me think about it more and kind of process it. So the kind solicitor who was doing my father's probate also helped me to liaise with my mother's solicitor. I think the solicitor was really surprised by how my mother was, because she wouldn't have any contact with me. She wanted it to be all through the solicitor. And in January of 2016, so my dad had been dead for about 6 months by then, my solicitor told me that my mum was really ill and wanted to see her grandchildren one last time before she died. She never really liked the children, but anyway, naturally I agreed. Part of me I think was doubtful that she would die, because she was only 78, which I know is a decent age, but she was only 78 at the time. And of course, she had cheated death so many times over the past 20 odd years. We went to visit her in South London, a 3-hour round trip, which was pretty awful. She looked at death's door, as she had so many times before, and it was a really strange meeting. She asked each child what they were doing. It was like talking to a stranger, really. She'd had a go at me for not telling her when my dad died, which hadn't been intentional. I just hadn't thought about telling her. Then she told me all about her plans for her funeral and that I was to organise it, and it was all arranged with a funeral home in Brighton with a green hoarding, but she couldn't remember the name, which I thought was quite typical of her. Then just after about 20 minutes, she just asked us to leave. She said she'd had enough. And as we were leaving, she kind of gripped my hand and she said, "Try to be good. You've never been good." Outside, I just broke down and I couldn't help but cry, even in front of the children. And my son, who was then about 14, said to me, "Look, ignore her, Mum, you're lovely," which was a really lovely moment. But it was just such an awful meeting with a parent I hadn't seen for 4 years. So I wrote to her and tried to put all my feelings on paper. I wanted her to know that what I think that we both missed out on what could have been a really lovely relationship. And then I just tried to put it out of my mind, as I had before. I was still very much sorting out my dad's flat, still grieving for him, and he'd been a massive hoarder, so it was a huge task to go through things. And then about 10 days later, at the end of February 2016, I was sitting at my desk at work, and somebody called from an unknown number. And the lady on the other end had this really quiet, soothing voice. And she said she was calling to arrange details for my mum's funeral. And my first feeling was relief. I think I'd been thinking I'd have to drive around all the funeral homes in town to find the one with the green hoarding that my mother had booked. And it was only when she said, "We have your mum's body with us," that it dawned on me that she wasn't talking about a future funeral, but that my mum had actually died. And I remember standing up from my desk and walking out to the office, really unable to speak. I finally managed to find my voice on the phone, and the lady was incredibly apologetic. She obviously thought I already knew about my mother's death, but I think it was a bank holiday weekend, and she'd spoken to her solicitor just before she died, and the solicitor then being told she died, who then told my solicitor that the email hadn't reached her, and it was one of those really, really strange things. I went through the rigmarole of making arrangements to go to the funeral home, and again, but arranging a funeral for someone you've had a really difficult relationship with is nothing like when you're close. So, you know, my mum and dad's funerals were so very different. I felt the need to explain and apologise to everyone that it was me doing the funeral, that I hadn't got on with my mum, and to give them a bit of backstory that I never really felt I needed to with my dad, because it was all really straightforward. Particularly her solicitor, who she'd been really close to. I went up there and had a really good meeting actually with him, where we kind of talked about, and he did say that she'd been difficult, and yeah, that was quite a cathartic process, I suppose. It turned out that the day before her death, she changed her will and left the proportion of my father's flat that she'd got over to my children, which at least I felt was something that hadn't gone to a charity, but had stayed in the family. I was really pleased, obviously, for them too. So the next day I found myself still in a real daze, going into her supported living flat to clear it out of her possessions, because the local authority needed it back straight away. And as I packed away the books and ornaments and went through her paperwork, I looked for clues really as to why she was the way she was, but there was really nothing. She'd known she was dying and she'd prepared really well for it. Everything was in place, everything was well organised. But I think it was there that I unconsciously had the germ of an idea, which would probably go on to change my life. What if I had discovered something at that point? So we held the funeral, which was attended just by me, my partner at the time, who had never met her, and my son. And it was terrible. It was a humanist service that she'd arranged. And that was fine. Everything about that was fine. But the celebrant at one point asked us all to think of a memory from when my mum and one had been happy. And my mind just went completely blank, and I just couldn't think of any time that she and I had been really happy together. I just started crying uncontrollably and just couldn't stop. She'd asked to have her ashes scattered from high ground. So after the cremation, we later got the ashes. I had them on the sideboard for a while, and I suddenly remembered the poor hamster's ashes from the previous summer. So I took both up to Devil's Dyke and used the hamsters to test the wind direction before scattering my mum's ashes while listening to the Moonlight Sonata, which was one of her favourite pieces of music. So after that, we went back and started to pick up the threads of our lives again. I really didn't feel able to grieve for a relationship I felt I'd never had. And obviously I hadn't seen her for a long time before she died, apart from that strange 20-minute meeting. So I didn't miss her in the same way that I did my father. It was a really strange period. And at the same time, I was really enjoying the creative writing course. I was getting some really good feedback from the tutor. But it probably took me another year or so to realise that what I was writing wasn't lots of sort of separate mini stories or exercises as I thought, but really part of a greater whole, what was essentially a fictionalised story about my mum and I. So in the story that I ended up writing, Emma's mother, Margaret, has died, and she's clearing out her house, and she discovers a family secret. And then Emma spends the whole book going back over her mother's life and finding out why her mother was such a difficult woman. And at the end of the story, she comes to accept why their relationship was so hard and realise that she needs to make sure she doesn't behave in the same way with her own children. So by the time I finished the first draft, I not only had a finished book, although obviously I'd go on to redraft it several times, but I had a much better understanding of my own grief. I realised that I think I'd felt at the time when my mum had died that I didn't have permission to grieve for her because we hadn't got on, because we didn't have that relationship. But somehow writing a fictionalised account of our relationship allowed me really to start processing that grief. And I also began to feel more at peace with our relationship. I think by seeing my character Margaret, who was my mother, through Emma's eyes, it was somehow much easier to understand my own mother. And I came to see that she hadn't wanted to be difficult, but perhaps the circumstances had made her so. She'd had quite a difficult childhood and a difficult relationship with her own mother. And while writing the book, I went through some old family photos. And I'd always really felt that my mother quite disliked me, not hated me, but just disliked me. And there were many photos where she's looking at me with such love in her eyes that really brought me to tears. So I want to just share a couple of those just to kind of show you what I mean, because get the right ones. If I can, how do I share?
There's a green button at the bottom.
Oh yes, the big green button which says share screen.
There we go.
Here we go. Can you guys see that one? Hopefully that's. So this is a picture I found, which I'd never seen my mum and me smiling.
We can't see it, but I don't know if I've pinned it on.
Let me try again.
And a little box. There we go. Perfect.
Does that work? Okay.
Yeah.
So let me put on the slideshow. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So that was the photo that I found that really moved me the most, that we both look really relaxed and happy and like any other kind of mum and daughter, really. So that was my favourite one. That and I dug out that, I think I'd had the book published by the time I found that one. This one I also really like. This is my mum and dad with me. It's not a great photo because this is the 1970s where photos weren't as good as they are now, but mum and dad with me, and they again look really happy. This is me and my mum at my baptism, and I just like the way that she's looking at me. I thought that was quite a moving picture. Oh, this is my mum and dad getting married. And then there was a couple more. Oh, this is just my dad and I. Quite why he let me wear such an inappropriate top, I don't know. But yeah, that's my dad and I, because as when I was a teenager. Let me get rid of those. So I think writing the book overall had also made me realise perhaps that I was at fault with my mum and my relationship. So just as Emma in the story is with Margaret, as an adult, I probably hadn't always behaved with her as I should have done. And although the book is very much fiction, I mean, it's a quite dramatic story, and my mum and I didn't have so much drama in our lives, fortunately. There were lots of examples of real things that did happen. At Margaret's funeral, for example, the celebrant does ask people to talk about a time they were happy, and Emma starts crying in the same way that I did. Emma sketches Margaret's ashes from the top of Devil's Dyke, as I did, but without the hamster element. There's also a tussle with the will as well, which obviously I experienced in real life. I think I felt I used the story really to process so much of my experience and my grief with my mum, and the grief not just for her dying, but the grief for the relationship that we didn't really have. It wasn't just for the last few years of our lives, but also for my childhood too. And then after months of rejections, months and months literally of rejections from literary agents and publishers, I was offered a book deal, and the book, which ended up being called The Girl in the Maze, came out last November. When my publisher asked me who the book would be dedicated to, there was obviously only one answer, my mum. I feel very much that we're shaped by our mothers, and if we lack them, as I felt I did, we are shaped by that loss. So writing The Girl in the Maze has been hugely therapeutic for me, and I really now feel quite at peace with the relationship that my mum and I had, and hopefully able to be a better mum for my children as a result. And I've since written a second book, which is out in November, and that's about an old family tale from my father's side of the family, and that book is dedicated to him. So although it's been 6 years now since my parents died, I still very much think about them all the time, and I still occasionally find myself moved to tears by, say, a piece of music or a particularly beautiful day or a memory. I think particularly with my mum more than my dad, because so much was left unsaid. And obviously when the book was published, I wish that they'd both been there to see it. We're going through, as a family, we're going through a really traumatic time with our middle child at the moment. And I would dearly love their advice, and it's at times like this that I miss that. But I sometimes do get that sense that, you know, they're there with me, even though clearly they're not there in person. So it seems to me that grief is very much an ongoing journey. I don't think you ever get over the loss of your parents, or indeed the loss of anyone. You just kind of shape yourself differently to accommodate their absence, and to somehow continue on with your own life. With no parents, I'm now seen in a kind of jokey kind of way as the matriarch of my family, something my 19-year-old son has commented on, and he now calls me Marjorie as a result. So I look back, and when we celebrated, this whole journey really began when we celebrated my father's 80th birthday in January 2015. I'm certainly a very different person from I was then, so perhaps the Marjorie new title is the right thing for that. So that is kind of my story. I'm very happy to answer any questions, or listen to any of your experiences too.
Thank you so much, Cathy. I think everyone would agree with me. That was both really beautifully kind of narrated and shared, and so interesting, particularly having the perspective of kind of having a very close relationship and then a difficult one, and those two different experiences. So I've got some questions. I'll get the ball rolling, and then if anyone else wants to come in. So I think it resonated. My parents are alive. I have difficult relationships with them, and I guess I was just interested, as someone who's kind of had a difficult relationship and maybe has pulled away, which is something that I've definitely done. Look, from kind of where you are now, what advice would you give, kind of if you were looking back at yourself or to someone else, probably me in this case? Would you do anything differently, or what would be your perspective on that?
I think I should have probably gone no contact with my mum a lot earlier. I think we kind of struggled on for a few years, and it was really difficult. I was going to see her quite regularly, feeling I was doing the right thing, and the relationship wasn't working. I think either we should have had a kind of a frank discussion, ideally had done that, but probably gone no contact earlier, because I think it came to a real head and it became quite nasty. But yeah, so I think perhaps, and I know people go no contact and they don't explain. I didn't explain, I just stopped. She never called me anyway, and I just stopped calling her, and that's how it kind of happened. But I think perhaps sitting down with that person and saying you're going no contact, or writing them a letter, perhaps is a good way to go about it, and perhaps I should have done that.
Thanks for that. And just it kind of struck me that there's the kind of mother-daughter relationship as a general term, and then there's your relationship with your mother specifically. And do you think, when do you feel like you've grieved the mother-daughter relationship? When do you think that's happened, or is that still happening?
I think that's still happening. And so I think I said my mum left when I was 12, just before, or just as I was kind of coming into that more difficult teenage phase. And wow, we're really going through it in spades at home with my daughter. And I kind of feel that, it's a kind of rite of passage, isn't it? Sometimes, okay, what we're going through is quite extreme, and I could really do without that. But that kind of tussle that you have with your mum in your teenage years is part of that mother-daughter kind of rite of passage. And I think the fact that we didn't go through that is really sad. And I think the relationship suffered as a result, because we hadn't become close, we hadn't been through that. So yeah, I feel that the more I spend time with my girls, particularly because my two youngest are girls, the more I think how I missed out on having that with my own mum. And I think that's an ongoing grief, that we didn't have that. She didn't come to, I've been married twice, and she didn't come to either of my weddings. The second one, she was dead, so that was a good excuse. But the first one, she was very much would have been able to come, and was invited and chose not to come. And all those lovely, she wasn't there when all the children were born, and those lovely moments that she could have been, and is such a lovely part of being a mum. And somehow she didn't feel able to do that for lots of different reasons. So I think, yeah, we definitely missed out. But I mean, it hopefully makes me be a different or a better mum, because I sort of think I really want to make sure I'm there for my children. They'll probably say, oh, mum was so overpowering, she was always so irritating, always interfering. But at least I will hopefully be there for them.
Thanks. Has anyone got any questions? I've got a couple more.
Yeah, just one thing. What was going to say? Do you think your mum was a bit jealous because you were close to your dad? I mean, I don't know how long you've been close to your dad, but I thought maybe that's what it was. It was her way of rebelling in a way, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there was a lot to that. I think my dad and I were quite similar people in many ways, and we just kind of got on. And my dad worked. My mum didn't work outside of the home, which obviously was quite usual in the 70s. And I think she found being a stay-at-home parent really boring, and resented the fact that I was always really interested in my dad when he came home, and I wasn't that interested in her, probably because we've been hanging out all day together. And yeah, I think, and because she left when I was 12, I think the idea was initially I was supposed to go and live in France with her, but it didn't happen that way. It then gradually we just drifted apart. So I think, and because obviously my dad and I were in the same country, and went through lots of shared experiences together, including those difficult teenage years, we developed that closeness. And yeah, he was always there for all those moments. He was there, and it meant that she kind of, when she came back to the UK, and she sort of came back in our life, she was a slight outsider, and that must have been really hard to take.
Yeah, would be. I mean, when you're talking about mum and daughter relationship, I've had problem with my eldest daughter with the relationship. Mine was really to do with my ex-husband. He used to hit my kids with a belt, and he was very abusive to me, and it did break the family, there was no doubt about it. And I left him in the end up, and it was difficult with the children, obviously, and she hid a lot of things. She was self-harming, and I didn't know she was doing that. And it was all down to what went on in the family. And she sort of blamed me why I didn't get him out of that situation. But it's going back she was born in 1980. So in those times, there wasn't that so much support out there the same. I know there was when they could come and take your kids away from you. I always knew that.
It's difficult to judge, isn't it, when you look back on times, because they are such different times. You can't say what things were like 30 years ago, because it was completely different to how it is now.
Yeah, that's right. And we're talking about now, but there's been times where we didn't speak for 1 year, and then this last time was 2 years. And it was difficult for me. And then I've lost my husband this year from COVID pneumonia in February. So she wanted to sort of, Mum, let me help. But everything was okay. But now it's sort of gone back to where we were before, where if I try and contact her, she's not easy to get hold of. I'm asking her questions about the children's things for Christmas, and she doesn't answer me. So I still feel there's something not right there. And it does upset me. I sent her a letter or an email, and I told her that I wish, that things could have been better. I was sorry if they thought that I didn't love them. I said, because I did. I said they were my world, and that was why I was trying to protect them by not losing them into going into care, because my ex-husband's first children from his first marriage, they went into care. So I was very cautious of that. So I think in all, it's been a very difficult journey, and now I've lost my husband, and he was the closest thing to me. And he's not the dad of the children. He's my third husband and my last. There won't be any more husbands. I can't. It's too upsetting when you lose them, especially on this one, because we were very close together. Anyway, thank you for letting me talk.
Thanks for sharing that, Melanie. I think it is really interesting just hearing different stories of difficult relationships, and it's so it's hard to, I think I always struggled, and as I've got older with my relationships with my parents, like I didn't speak to my dad for a period, and actually, now I'm getting older, maybe understanding things a bit more, or excusing things as well. I think sometimes it's like there's the trade-off that I'm making is like, is this relationship worth it overall? And like, there's that gentle tipping slide. I think I was interested, Cathy, because that, and what you were saying about you have to, about the mother-daughter relationship and grieving that, because in a way, how do I put this? You don't know, if you don't know what you're missing, then it's kind of, and sometimes I feel that way. And it's, I think if people don't understand it, then it can be quite interesting that if you don't, that actually there's nothing, it's nothing lost if you don't know what it feels like necessarily.
Well, I guess there is that. I think when you see other people doing things with their mothers, you think, oh. And then as my girls have got older, I thought there's such joy. Okay, there's really tough times as well in raising children, definitely. But there's such joy in bits of it as well. And you think, what a shame that my mum missed out on that stuff. And that I missed out on having that, you know, that relationship with her. Although my dad did a very good job trying to be both parents.
Has anyone else got any comments or things, questions? I think one last thing I wanted to pick up on was you said that you did the kind of saying goodbye multiple times. How that experience was for you?
It is really strange, isn't it? Because the first time you think, when someone's dying and you say goodbye, that's a really emotional thing to do. And then they don't die, fortunately. And this was when my mum was in her I was in my 20s, and my mum must have been in her early 60s. And then, so each time it has not less of an impact, but it definitely feels less, because you've been through a bit of that emotion before, but then you're also thinking maybe this will be the time. But honestly, it happened so many times that it really did feel, and there was some suicide attempts as well, and it was such a difficult kind of 10 years or so, and then her health did stabilize to a degree until the end. But yeah, it's a really strange thing. But I think you have that, and I'm sure everyone here to a degree has had that. So every time I left my dad in that last month of his life, I wondered whether he would still be there when I came back in the morning. So I think we all do that to a degree, don't we?
Well, thank you so much, Cathy. That was really, really interesting. If people want to buy your book, where can they get it?
Just at I think it's at some Waterstones, independent bookshops, on Amazon, usual places.
Great, thank you. It's definitely something that I'm interested in reading, and yeah, thank you for such an interesting talk. It's been really lovely hearing your story and you sharing it so eloquently, and hearing kind of all the different facets of your experience as well, and your processing. So thank you so much. And I've just shared the link as well to Untangle. If anyone has had a bereavement or they're looking for some support, we have a supportive community on there, and experts that can offer help and advice. So please do sign up as well. And this recording will be put on there afterwards too. So if you want to watch it back or share it with everyone or anyone, it will be on there. So thank you so much, Cathy. And yeah, I hope everyone has a lovely evening. It's been great. Really appreciate you sharing with us.
Thanks so much, Emily. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Yes, great.